USPAP page 138, Advisory Opinion 25, AO-25. This communication by the Appraisal Standards Board, ASB, does not establish new standards or interpret existing standards. Advisory opinions are issued to illustrate the applicability of appraisal standards in specific situations and to offer advice from the ASB for the resolution of appraisal issues and problems. Subject: clarification of the client in a federally related transaction. Application: real property. The issue: the appraisal rules adopted by the Federal Financial Institutions Regulatory Agencies in August 1990 to comply with Title 11 of the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act of 1989, FIREA, impose a requirement on regulated institutions that if an appraisal is prepared by a fee appraiser, the appraiser shall be directly engaged by the regulated institution or its agent. In some cases, however, a property owner might directly engage the services of an appraiser for one intended use, but later desire to use the appraisal report in a federally related loan transaction. This and other similar scenarios lead to the question: does an appraiser have an obligation to ensure that his or her services are directly engaged by a federally related financial institution? Advice from the ASB on this issue. Relevant USPAP and advisory references. Definitions, specifically client, intended user, and intended use. The ethics rule. Scope of work rule, which requires an appraiser to determine an appropriate scope of work to produce credible assignment results, including all assignment conditions. Standards Rule 1-2A and 1-2B, which require an appraiser to identify the client, intended user, and intended use. Standards Rule 2-1A, which requires an appraiser to clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal in a manner that is not misleading. Advisory Opinion 26, which covers readdressing, which means transferring, a report to another party. Advisory Opinion number 27, which addresses appraising the same property for a new client. Advisory Opinion 30, appraisals for use by a federally related financial institution. And advisory opinion number 36, identification and disclosure of client, intended use, and intended users. Comments. USPAP requires an appraiser to identify the intended use and intended users in an appraisal assignment. USPAP also requires that appraisers not be misleading in the marketing of their services. See management section of the ethics rule. Advisory Opinion 30 provides guidance on the applicability of federal regulations and USPAP obligations when performing appraisals for use by a federally regulated financial institution. In order to not be misleading when contacted by a prospective client, the appraiser's obligation is one of Proper disclosure. Before an appraiser accepts an assignment, knowing the intended use of the appraisal is or may be for a federally related transaction by a federally regulated financial institution, it is that appraiser's responsibility to disclose to the prospective client that the lender or its agent is required to directly engage the appraiser. The appraiser should also disclose to the prospective client that it is unethical for the appraiser to later readdress or otherwise change the report to indicate a federally regulated financial institution was the client when the appraisal was performed for another party. See AO-26, titled Readdressing, which means transferring a report to another party, and AO-27, titled Appraising the Same Property for Another Client, for related advice on this issue. If the client still wishes to proceed with the appraisal after the appraiser has properly fulfilled these disclosure obligations, the appraiser can accept the assignment. It would be prudent to recite disclosures in the engagement page 139, letter, and in the report. Also refer to Advisory Opinion 36 for additional information relating to intended use and intended users. Illustrations. Number 1. Homeowner Susan Daly contacts appraiser John Hunt to perform an appraisal on her residence. She is considering refinancing and wants to determine the amount of equity in the residence before completing a loan application. Assuming the refinancing would be a federally related transaction at a federally regulated financial institution, what is John's responsibility to this potential client? Answer. Before John accepts this assignment, it is his responsibility to disclose to Susan that a lender or its agent is required to directly engage the services of an appraiser in a federally related transaction and should not accept his appraisal report. If Susan still wants to engage John, his disclosure allows him to accept the assignment. Number 2, a buyer of a commercial building contacts appraiser Jane Johnson about appraising the property for financing. The buyer explains that he will likely be providing the report to an insurance company that is interested in financing the property. The insurance company has no problem with the buyer being the client as long as the insurance company is identified as an intended user in this assignment. However, the buyer says that he may also make application to his local bank, a federally regulated financial institution. Can Jane accept this assignment? If so, does she have any disclosure obligations? Answer. Jane has an obligation to disclose to the buyer that the federally regulated financial institution should not accept her appraisal report because a lender or its agent is required to directly engage the services of an appraiser in a federally related transaction. If the buyer still wants to engage Jane, her disclosure allows her to accept the assignment.